Hi. I'm still finishing the setup, so not everything's in place yet. Trying to make sure that I can be seen well in both spaces. So, figured I'd go live over here before I went live on TikTok today. Make it a little bit easier. I think that's going to work. I hope everybody is having a grand night. The computer angle is a little bit weird. Let me see if I can make this a little bit better over there. Okay. I hope everybody is having a grand night. I have done this a couple of times during the day this week. This is something that was requested of me from an Afro-Indigenous person who is seeing a lot of lateral violence within a couple of the communities that they belong to. Being Afro-Indigenous, meaning that they belong to both a community of African descent and the Turtle Island Indigenous community. And I meant to get in and do this during the evening once or twice this week, but my physical capabilities have made that not work, not functional, unfortunately. And so we're going to go ahead and do it tonight. I will open up comments. I will be opening up the ability to speak to other people. It won't stay comment-free forever, but it makes it easier. If you're new to my lives, they get very trolly very quick, and usually the comments are off by request. But I thought we'd start with them off tonight just because it makes it a little bit easier for me. My name is Sarah, and I am a Widda. Thank you so much, Elms. My name is Sarah, and I am a Widda. The term Widda comes from Celtic Indigenous peoples. It is a Celtic Indigenous term, but I am globally mixed Indigenous, and that Indigenous includes Turtle Island. I have grandmother Nani, who was Red Paint Clan Band Cherokee, my grandmother Polly, who was Miwok, but her children were registered Quapaw. And I was raised in Turtle Island Indigenous community within the Pacific Northwest. I have a second mother who is Turtle Island Indigenous within the Pacific Northwest. I do not consider my lane to be teaching Turtle Island Indigenous stuff, and that is not what I am teaching tonight. Also have history from Africa. My grandmother Philomena escaped slavery in 1750, pregnant with her master's child. And through DNA, I know that she came from the Sudan. I also have ancestry pretty much everywhere else. But even though I'm very light of skin and white assumed, my history, the ancestry that I was raised within, and the love and the knowledge that I was raised within really comes from a couple of different communities. I know from my growing up and from my learning of the elders, that the stories within Turtle Island Indigenous communities go back, thousands and thousands of years. We have got really low on the people, so I think I can turn on the comments because it looks like it is melted down a bit. So you're free to comment if you like to. I know that stories within the community that I was raised within go back thousands and thousands of years. And if you talk to many Indigenous communities, the stories within those communities, their grandmothers have told them. It is not something that they've read from some book. It's not something that people get from white man's account. It's something that their grandmothers have told them, and that their grandmothers learned because their grandmothers have told them, right? OLAC, I'm not sure what that is, Earth. So because of that, I know that the stories here go back generation upon generation, which gives that knowledge of here generation upon generation. And so I really want to do what I've tried to do, or what we have done every one of these, and open this not with a story that I might tell or a story that somebody might have told me, but from words of a very beautiful Indigenous human being. Uh, the Olmec heads are behind me, yes, but I am not Olmec. I might be. I have ancestry in South America, and Turtle Island indigeneity is not, like by your borders. They're by different borders, but not to my knowledge do I have Olmec connections. So what I'm going to start us off with is a book, the first few pages of a book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a mother, scientist, decorated professor, and enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. Her first book, Gathering Moss, was awarded the John Burroughs Medal for Outstanding Nature Writing. Her writings have appeared in Orion, O Magazine, and numerous scientific journals. She lives in Fabius, New York, where she is SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor of Environmental Biology and the founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. So I'm going to teach you guys tonight, or tell you guys tonight, the story of Sky Woman, which is a story that is among a few different groups, so it's going to fluctuate and change slightly. There are several different creation stories in the Turtle Islands, and this is one of many, and they're all very beautiful. In the winter, when the green earth lies resting beneath a blanket of snow, this is the time for storytelling. The storytellers begin by calling upon those who came before, who passed the stories down to us, for they are only messengers. In the beginning, there was Sky World. If it gets nasty in here and I'm not paying attention because I'm reading, if you're modding or somebody else, if you'll at me, and I'll try and keep an eye out and make sure that I can turn off comments if it gets nasty again. It's really, really high again. She felt like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world. You don't know my culture to tell me that. And nose rings and piercings go back to the Neanderthals. I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist as well. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear or maybe hope, she clutched a bundle tightly in her hand. And again, I will turn comments on again in a couple minutes when I'm done speaking, but people get rude and obnoxious and think that it's appropriate to speak when, again, not my words, but when an important human being's words are being spoken and passed on. It's rude. It's not something we should be doing. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below, but in that emptiness there were many eyes gazing up the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled towards them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall, far from the only home she'd ever known. She caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward, and so it begun. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beaver, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Turn another page. Greatly she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water, and they agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was too far, and after a long while he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help. otter, beaver, sturgeon, but the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned gasping for air with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of all. He volunteered to go while others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative, and, before long, a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back, and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. Moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, she sang in thanksgiving and then began to dance. Her feet caressed the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made, not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all of the animals' gifts and coupled with her deep gratitude. Together they formed what we know of today as Turtle Island, our home. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. The bundle was still clenched in her hand. When she toppled from the hole in the sky world, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp were branches, fruits and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the sky world, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere. And now that the animals too had plenty to eat, many came to live with her on Turtle Island. Our stories say that of all the plants, wingash, or sweetgrass, was the very first to grow on the earth. Its fragrance, a sweet memory of Sky Woman's hand. Accordingly, it is honored as one of the 4 sacred plants of my people. Breathe in its scent and you will start to remember things you didn't know you'd forgotten. Our elders say that ceremonies are the way we remember to remember, and so sweetgrass is a powerful ceremonial plant cherished by many indigenous nations. It is also used to make beautiful baskets. Both medicine and a relative, its value is both material and spiritual. There is such a tenderness in braiding the hair of someone you love. Kindness and something more flow between the braider and the braided, the two connected by the cord of the plait. Wingash waves in strands, long and shining like a woman's freshly washed hair. And so we say it is the flowing hair of Mother Earth. When we braid sweetgrass, we are braiding the hair of Mother Earth, showing her our loving attention, our care for her beauty and well-being, and gratitude for all she has given us. Children hearing the Sky Woman's story from their birth know in their bones the responsibility that flows between humans and the earth. The story of Sky Woman's journey is so rich and glittering, it feels to me like a deep bowl of celestial blue from which I could drink again and again. It holds our beliefs, our histories, our relationships. Looking into that starry bowl, I see images swirling so fluidly that the past and the present become as one. Images of Sky Woman speak not just of where we came from, but of also how we can go forward. Turtle Island has had Homo sapiens on it for 33,000 years by archaeological records. Our latest finds on Turtle Island show that we have a species of Homo erectus speciation that made it over here at 130,000 years ago. Likely they were here well before that, had come over as Homo erectus and had speciated, and we have just now found a find so far. As an archaeologist and an anthropologist, when I entered into the community and into my education, I knew the history of archaeology and anthropology, and that within the history of archaeology and anthropology was a great deal of racism. That the field itself was grave robbers. and that the field itself had caused problems. Not only had it doubled down on racism, but it had doubled down on harm within Turtle Island to Turtle Island Indigenous knowledge and to Turtle Island Indigenous finds. Now, as I said before, growing up within Indigenous communities, learning to read with books written by Black and Indigenous authors of Black and Indigenous histories, and archaeology books about finds in Turtle Island, which really set me on that path of a love of archaeology and anthropology, and not really entering into Western culture for pretty much the first decade and a half of my life. And then it wasn't that fun when I did. For me, I've often and always seen the rich and deep history that is here within Turtle Island and the problems that archaeology and anthropology had about it, and created within it. When I got into archaeology and pursued a degree, there is an account when modern day archaeology is looking at archaeology of the past, it is trying to take accountability and a reckoning right now. It is in a space where it is very much asking people to call it out. And it is in a space where it is very much trying to fix the mistakes of its past, or at least hold accountability for them, at least with the professors and the people that I have come across within the field. And because of that, it addresses a lot of the issues. And one of these issues is things like the fact that Washington, as in the first president of our country, documents watching an indigenous, and he thought himself as an amateur archaeologist, and documents watching an indigenous group bury a young woman with all of her grave goods, with all of her belongings, the things that she needed, and then going up and digging up her body out of the mound and stealing her body and the stuff as an archaeologist. This is prevalent through early archaeology. And one thing that is currently going on in this, looking at this and in this taking accountability and this reckoning with the past of early archaeology, is this need and desire to go back and look over shit from the past and restudy it in a way and in a visualization that is not as white, not as Western thought process, right? Not as well, we've decided you're primitive and therefore you must have been primitive to justify our, atrocities and the shit that we've been doing, right? Which we've discussed before in here. So one of those things is that they're looking at earlier finds and they're looking at different things in different levels and in different layers. So we're redating things. Not only are we redating things, but we're looking at the way things actually speak to us. Does this speak to us of what our Western thought says? Or if we hear the indigenous communities around us, is it going to speak with us different? Now, that doesn't mean that I have a lot of answers for you right now based on any of that shit. And I'm not here to provide answers. That's not what I try and do. I don't work within Turtle Island Indigenous archaeology because of the problems within Turtle Island Indigenous archaeology, and because of me, just who I am in my space and in my lanes, right? And because of what I've been asked to do by my elders and by the members of my community, which is to help people who look like me find their own ancestry, so that they stop appropriating other ancestries, right? So because of that, we're talking before the land bridge. So because of that, I don't really teach or work a lot within Turtle Island Indigenous archaeology. Hi, Rosie. But what I do is take things that I find that prove Turtle Island Indigenous creation stories and histories that I know of because they have been shared with me by my community members, and give those out as a public level for access and freedom for everybody so that you can all know how to find this information and have it. And so when somebody says, oh, blah, 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 you can say, nope, because my history says and your science proves, right? And so that's really my only focus within Turtle Island Indigenous archaeology or Turtle Island archaeology at all. That being said, that does mean that I do know stuff, right? And it also means that I also really try to work on decolonization within the archaeological community as I interact with it as well, right? Hi, Shishi. So because of that, I've learned a lot and I know a lot about these specific things. So we're going to talk about what we see with the archaeology tonight. And then after we're done talking about what we see with the archaeology and what we know to be current fact, we're going to go ahead and open space. It is still and always will be an open space for Indigenous people since we were talking about Indigenous issues. And I do realize that my comments are off frequently. I apologize for that. It is not to block Indigenous people from coming up and speaking. It is very specifically because there's so much hate sometimes in the comments in my chat. And so I want to make sure that we keep it down. So with all of that, what Turtle Island Indigenous archaeology shows us is that the people that were here prior to 1492, prior to contact with Columbus, okay, prior to Columbus's start of his atrocities, from finds that we have from people, okay, as in skeletal remains, ancient DNA. Ancient DNA, again, is something that we've really only gone, within the last 20 years, okay? So what we see is that the people who were here pre-contact by DNA are a unique group. What we see about this unique group is that they have come out of Africa in its final exodus, we believe. This is current knowledge. Facts change. Every day, facts change, knowledge changes. Everything changes along the way, but this is what is proven currently. Until the proven currently changes into something new, it is what we have, right? Gravity might change tomorrow. Facts change, right? Nothing is forever. Nothing is set, right? Just remember. So this is our current knowledge. So out of Africa 50,000 years ago. And what this means is that these are the final group. We lived like side by side with the Neanderthals in the Levant until about, between 150 till about 50,000 years ago. The last ice age starts receding from Eurasia at about 50,000 years ago. We do see that Indigenous Australians are there about 70,000 years ago. We see that in DNA, and we see that in actual evidence of finds in Australia. We also see that there is an erectus find in Australia at 120,000 years ago. So we do see that there are other people there. So we know that people aren't making it out until 50,000 years ago across the globe. So what we find at 130,000 years ago in Turtle Island is absolutely erectus. At 50,000 years ago when Sapien is making it out, we see that they spent 10,000 years mixing and interacting and living with Denisovian to get the amount of DNA, of Denisovian DNA, that we see in pre-colonized Turtle Island indigenous beings. So there is 0.02 to 0.03 Denisovian DNA in pre-contact Turtle Island indigenous peoples that we have ancient DNA on, which means that they spent about 10,000 years as the estimate commingling and living. We believe that this happens in Eurasia. So this is somewhere in the first 10, maybe 20,000 years outside of Eurasia. They're currently looking at a southern boat route. This is something that I have been talking about for a hot minute. The Denisovian DNA kind of really proves it. But the current look is that Turtle Island indigenous people at roughly 35, 40,000 years ago take a southern boat route across the islands of the South Pacific to get to South America and then migrate up from South America. This is current finds. All of my stuff is on the website and widdaord.com. You'll see all of this stuff under Turtle Island Indigenous information for Turtle Island Indigenous people. So with this, we're seeing that Turtle Island Indigenous people is going back to at least, so our oldest finds that we have of remains or of tools in Turtle Island, not counting the ones that they recently proved or decided that they proved that there's still some question on it, might have had to do with a primate monkey that is down in the South American region, and that's where those ones come from. The ones that I am talking about are all in North America. So we have one in a cave in Mexico that's 33,000 years ago. We have one in a cave in the Yukon, which is 27,000 years ago. And then we have the white sand footprints, which is 23 to 27,000 years ago. The Yukon is a bone with carving on it, tool marks, and the 33,000 year one in Mexico is flint napped tools. Flint napped tools. Verbiage working. I don't think so. We've gone over a lot of this a bit. Just, we touched on this a little bit before when we touched on other things to debunk, right? So we have touched on it a little bit before. Just the different finds that we see in Turtle Island. So this shows us that Turtle Island indigenous people have been here for 33,000 years at minimum. Now, the 133,000 years Cerruti Macedon find. Within Turtle Island indigenous people, we see that there are Neanderthal DNAs, so Neanderthal intermixing with Neanderthals. We see that there's Denisovian intermixing, and we see what we call a ghost species. There's been a lot about this in the news lately, and you might have heard about this, but a ghost species is a species that we see a little bit of them in our DNA, but we haven't found them in the fossil record yet. And the ghost species within Turtle Island indigenous DNA pre-contact with Europe is, pre-contact as in modern contact, because there is evidence that we migrated back from Turtle Island into Europe that is coming out that we've always known, but it's just coming out now. So my brain froze on that for a second. But pre-1492, Columbus coming over here and attacking people, what we see is that the DNA in those groups of people, those ancient DNA finds, shows a ghost species within that DNA. This is very likely to be whatever species that Homo erectus came over here and speciated into. Just like Homo erectus makes it around the rest of the globe and speciates into Neanderthal, Denisovium, Florensis, Nalari, those Lonzensis, all of these other species that we're seeing currently in the fossil record. Right now is the time in paleoanthropology and in ancient archaeology, because it is like all of this shit is really like all within the last 10 years, right? All within the last 10 years. So with this shows us that Turtle Island indigenous people have a unique DNA signature. That unique DNA signature includes a ghost species that we do not see anywhere else. Not only do they have a unique DNA signature with that, but they have a unique mitochondrial DNA and they have a unique Y DNA. The unique mitochondrial DNA is MTX1. So X1 is only seen here in Turtle Island. X2, which is a sub DNA of X1, which is that backwards migration pattern, is seen in Siberia. And I don't remember the Y DNA. I want to say it's Q, but I don't want to get Q mixed up because Q might be Australia and not Turtle Island. So let me not get those mixed up. So we're seeing that this is the group of people. One of these finds is 15,000 years ago, right? We actually, not one of these finds, two of these finds, okay? We have a find in St. Lawrence, Alaska at 15,000 years ago, and a find at Brazil at 15,000 years ago. And both of these finds demonstrate Denisovian DNA, Neanderthal DNA, and a ghost species DNA. These are 15,000-year-old finds in Turtle Island of DNA. Can't argue that. Can't argue that. Can't argue that, okay? So, the other thing that we see within Turtle Island indigenous people is that one thing that seems to be very unknown is the fact that, first of all, 20 years ago, everybody thought we were all gone. Let's face it. 20 years ago, 50 years ago, everybody thought that Turtle Island indigenous people have become extinct. Okay, that's why the comment's still here. That's why that cry, right? Because 30, 50, years ago, 20 years ago, everybody thought that we were extinct, right? Um, Second of all, Turtle Island indigenous people, most, well, not most spaces, but everything across like the west, like the plains over is 1800s on, right? So we're looking at places that haven't been colonized for 200 years, which means that we're looking at places where grandma is still able to speak to children often about times prior to colonization. We're looking at spaces where many people were able to, maybe not an entire group or an entire band or an entire nation, to hide out or to retain anonymity, but where several smaller groups are able to do that and to pass on the stories and to pass on the understanding of the land and to pass on that indigeneity, the language, everything. We still have our languages, right? In so many spaces, we still have our languages. Many times it is a fight to retain them, and many times it is a fight to bring them back. And we have so many communities that are working so actively, where their language may have almost died out, but we still have our languages. And so, as we're moving forward into this, I think that that's one thing that I want to remind people is that if you're talking to groups of people who still have living memory of times that are pre colonized and their languages, trying to erase them is doubly shitty and stupid because your logic is faulty. Okay. Um, and I'm sure there's plenty I'm missing out on and leaving out, but I'm also seeing it's like really fucked up in here. And I want to state that, you know, uh, okay, so let me ask you, precision. Oh, never mind. I won't ask you. North America alone is larger than Eurasia. I'd like to point that out. North America alone is larger than Eurasia. In 2,000 years ago, in Western Eurasia, people were building, or Eastern Eurasia, people were building large advanced cities. 2,000 years ago, right? The Asian empires 2,000 years ago are largely advanced. They have advanced weaponry. They have advanced knowledge, like advanced fucking knowledge. Um, Whereas the Europeans are still living in hovels. So if the Europeans could be living in hovels on one side of Eurasia 2,000 years ago, and on the other side of Eurasia, you see that Asians are living in advanced cities with advanced knowledge. Does that tell you that maybe in a country, in a continent that's bigger than Eurasia, that you could have a group living in a teepee and a group building a mound? By the way, the Sami people built teepees too. So Eurasia has teepees as well, right? So, like, why would you think that just because one group did one thing, another group couldn't have done another thing, right? Well, okay, so I'll be real. I wouldn't mind a longhouse, but it's not an advanced city with an advanced sewage system, whereas East Asia is an advanced city with an advanced sewage system. And I'll be real, I'd live in a dugout before I'd live in anything else. But it's definitely not the advanced sewage system, the advanced nature that you see in Asia, right? So, why you would think that people couldn't have both of those things, right? By the way, I mean, 2,000 years ago, uh, Africa has the most advanced civilization on the planet 2,000 years ago, right? And in Africa, there At the same time, groups that are extremely agriculture are not agriculture animistic, that live in indigenous ways, that are so close to the earth that they don't leave record behind, which is absolutely a better way for the ecology. Um, and that's two different places in Africa, leading to different, beautiful, fascinating civilizations, right? One that uh, doesn't leave anything behind because it has no need to, because it's blending in with the biome around it. And one that leaves vast monuments that stir our heart. Well, that's like 5,000 years ago, right? So, like, nobody said pre America was Asian. I was comparing Eurasia to North America. It was a landmass size with different cultures, and the ability to have two different cultures, thousands thousands of miles apart, that have two different civilizations and two different ways of building their homes. That's what I was saying. Yes, biome, but not within that, because that's not their biome. Building an advanced city that does not work within the ecology is not a part of the biome. You need to be working within the ecology and being a part of the biome to be a part of the biome. I often sound crazy. I would venture that if you're living in today's society and you think of yourself as sane, you probably are really insane. Just saying, because it's kind of fucked. And if you can live within it and be okay within it and not go, fuck me, then. So the website is nwiddaord.com. And all of these things are sources in that website, right? Again, I am an archaeologist and an anthropologist. This is what I do. Besides the fact that I'm Turtle Island Indigenous. So these are things that I've known most of my life. Takio Weston. I said same landmass, like same space. And I think it is like by square miles, isn't it? Nobody said the Denisovians were giants. Seal, Jessica. Not by much. Easy, are you asking me something? Do I know about the Olmec people? No. I haven't studied the Olmec people beyond the understanding that their knowledge within the archaeological community, like a very surface level, like we know that the Olmecs actually descend into the Mayans, like it's the same group down the line. This is pictures of the Olmec head with Mayan people, Olmec heads with Mayan people. I'm showing you what people are saying is phenotypically African, that is not phenotypically African. I've not seen anything about that easy. Uh, I use nations. Clans is something completely different. Clans, so a clan is like your matrilineal line or your patrilineal line or your, it's a different thing than the, um, so vocabularically, which is not a word in and of itself. The word tribe means a familial group, and the word band means a group that is a bunch of different familial lines put together. These words go back, they're ancient Latin, and they were first attributed to the Celtic tribes and the Germanic tribes. Um, and uh, Usually, a nation can consist of several different tribes or bands. Now, the word tribe, as referring to several nations within the United States or within the Turtle Islands, is rude, right? Because we're looking at it as, and we have equated the word tribe or tribal to mean primitive when it is not. Um, it is actually just about the way a group of people, like a culture's family lines work and family lines work, the verbiage. So, because it has been used so harmfully, using words like nation apply better, especially when you're talking about different nations within Turtle Island, like the Lakota Nation or like the Denali Nation, right? Uh, when it comes to clans, your clan is not your nation or a different group within your nation. It is within your band or your group. So like instead of it, it's your family line within your community instead of your community name, right? And so I would use nations permanently. That personally, that's what I use. And that's what a lot of people I know have been working towards using as we work towards changing languages to be more for reflective of what they're supposed to be. An ethnic group would not be like a clan. An ethnic group would be more like a nation, maybe, um, or an overall, I don't know. Because ethnic group mixes a whole bunch of different things because ethnic group is not just about where you are located, but it is about cultural heritage and what your cultural heritage states about you or what your cultural heritage gives you or provides connection for, right? Your community. So not quite. Uh, Gabrielle, we don't use that word anymore. Uh, this there that's a slur, right? ESKIMOS is a slur. Uh, we're talking about oftentimes Inuit, but it's often Aluit, and there's several different nations among the peoples of the Arctic within Turtle Island. Do not see any evidence that Turtle Island indigenous people have any connection to the Basque. The Basque are a unique group. The Basque have been in their space for probably the last 5,000 to 10,000 years. And while they have some genetic admixture from outside, they do not have a whole lot. And it is thought that they did not come from the steppes groups where most other current uh, so like all the descents of the Celts and the Germanics all come from over near the steppes because they come up. It's thought that the Basque actually come directly over. Uh, Redbone, I am discussing what DNA states and what archaeology states about peoples within Turtle Island pre 1492. There was a lot of issue within community that there's a lot lateral violence going on. And I was asked by an Afro Indigenous human being to hold this space and to have this discussion as a space to talk about pre-colonized Turtle Island because they're tired of being caught in the middle of that lateral violence, I would think. Um, and to talk about the proof that we have of Turtle Island Indigenous people being Turtle Island Indigenous people. Your book, Adam, is out of date. You're no longer Northeast Asian. There's no evidence anymore that they're Northeast Asian. We thought there is evidence that there is some backtrack of the mitochondrial DNA and stuff from Turtle Island back into Siberia. That's the latest evidence that's coming out. But there's a lot more evidence that shows that they're coming along the southern part of East Eurasia, across the Pacific Islands, into South America. We are all on this planet genetically connected to Neanderthals, including everybody of African descent, based on finds pre-colonized within Africa. Everybody except for the Khoi people of South Africa and the Oyo people of West Africa have Neanderthal DNA, and those two spaces have three other ghost species DNA within them. Like I said, I'm just going with the facts. I'm just going with the evidence. All of my stuff is sourced. It's all on my website. So, current thought process by DNA tracing. We're all Homo sapiens. We all come from Africa. The group that everybody is descended from outside of Africa leaves Africa 50,000 years ago. Other than indigenous Australians who have been there for 70,000 years, at this point is when the ice is receding from Eurasia. And as the ice is receding from Eurasia, people start moving across the bottom of Eurasia. They don't go west first because of the way that the water is in that area and the mountain ranges, right? They go east first. And in that eastward track, you see that from skeletal remains 15,000 years ago in northern Turtle Island and in southern Turtle Island. So one in St. Lawrence Island in Alaska and one in Brazil. We're seeing that they spent about 10,000 years living among the Denisovians and the Neanderthals. They get Neanderthal DNA, they get Denisovian DNA. And then they also have a ghost species that is unique to Turtle Island, only seen in Turtle Island. Our oldest evidence of sapiens in Turtle Island is 33,000 years ago. Excuse me, again. Our current understanding is this is from a trip across the east, the southeast of Eurasia into the Pacific Islands, and a boat route across the Pacific Islands, and picking up probably around 10 to 15,000 years within Asia as they're migrating over into and over. There's also ties with Austrasia, but there are no ties that show there's any correlation with Africa after that 50,000 years ago. Okay, Adam. Again, most of the stuff I'm talking about right now is within the last 2 years. We are currently at a place. So 20 years ago, the guy who just won the Nobel Prize for his advancements of DNA, he invented something called polymerase chain reaction, which is the ability to test ancient DNA because it takes the strands of DNA that you get and it replicates them. You destroy the material that you grab the DNA from and then the DNA strands itself when you test them. So until this, we weren't able to test ancient DNA. So PCR's invention, which is how he's able to see or to do the full genome sequence of Neanderthal, also gives us the ability to start testing Kennewick Man. Okay. And different finds here within Turtle Island. Now, some have been repatriated already, so we don't get DNA from them, which is great because sovereignty is important and they should have gone home to their ancestors where they belonged. Okay. But within South America, we get a few more finds. We got DNA from Kennewick Man. We do see DNA from St. Lawrence in Alaska. This DNA gives us this information, but we were only able to access this within the last few years. And because we're only able to access this within the last few years, your books are outdated. That's what I'm telling you. My information comes from published articles within scientific journals within the last 5 years, because we are going through this massive influx of new knowledge because we have all these new tools. And with all of these new tools, we have all of this new ways to prove Turtle Island Indigenous people right. And a lot of people are. So this is what we are talking about tonight. I'm not telling you that your book is wrong or was wrong when it was written. I'm telling you that it's currently wrong. This is the current knowledge. I don't know. Maybe because the articles came out within the last 6 months, as I just stated 3 times. Most of this information is from the last 5 years. The boat articles came out 4 months ago, 3 months ago. We were talking about these when they came out. And the DNA find about the Denisovians and them showing that that is going across that southern, this has all been since July. All of that information has come out since July of last year. And again, the articles are on the website, right? I'm not changing things to fit a narrative. And that's the point. I'm not changing things to fit a narrative. I'm not telling people that the stories that they've held in place for 1,000 to 2,000 to 30,000 years are incorrect. I'm telling them that they're correct, and science finally proves that they're correct. You're telling them they're incorrect based on some white fucking science that tells you it's a conspiracy theory they're hiding from you, instead of listening to Turtle Island Indigenous voices telling you what their own histories are. That's the second time you said it, Tomahawk. Good for you. I'd love to see yours. I'm not here to prove myself to you. The idea that I have to prove myself to you is bullshit. If you've asked me for protocol, I've already given protocol. If you're a Turtle Island Indigenous person, you know what that is. And I will not give names, family names that you can talk to in public, because I'm not going to dox myself. But if you want to IM me, I can, right? I don't dox myself, so I'm not going to dox family members. And if you're doxing family members on here, that's kind of problematic. Sorry. I look like 528 plus years of colonization. And if you have a problem with that, take it up with the white people who raped my Black and Indigenous grandmothers. And you can kiss whatever you want to along the way. My science isn't white science. I don't work within the white archaeological community or the white scientific community. Everything is about me as Indigenous science. Every way that I treat science is Indigenous. Dox means putting somebody in a way that somebody can find them personally in real life. A lot of people get death threats on here, and a lot of people end up harmed because their names and their information got put here in public. I was in Portland in 2020, and I was in Standing Rock in 2016. And in Portland in 2020, I got doxxed pretty badly. So I don't dox myself anymore because I don't like death threats on my front door. Thank you. But yeah, I mean, I'll tell you my dead grandmother's names, right? I'll give that, but I won't give you the current people in my family. And like I said, if you are Turtle Island Indigenous and you want that from me, I totally respect that. I am me, and I'll give it to you. I just won't put it in public, right? Because it's just not that. It's just not appropriate. I've looked at the Civil Rights Act and how it's written. It's got its own problems, right? It's all got its own problems. Thank you. Not trying to look good at all. Just to say, yeah, I know you don't like the nose ring, whatever, but I'm not trying to look attractive, because every time I look attractive, men hurt me. So really, honestly, I'm trying to look as ugly as I can, so you stay as far away as I can get you. Just saying. Many people get adopted into tribes, and you are correct. And people who get adopted into tribes are absolutely Turtle Island Indigenous people, correct? Because they've been adopted into a nation. It's a totally different thing. There's always a lot of dissent in this chat, Firecracker, even when we're talking about paleoanthropology. Usually at that point, it's the anti-evolutionists who are really my my chat is always troll heavy, and I'm not sure why. Thank you. Tomahawk. Turtle Island Indigenous. Okay, so what we're talking about tonight is preventing the erasure of Turtle Island Indigenous people. Afro-Indigenous people are Turtle Island Indigenous people, right? Because they're part Black and part Turtle Island Indigenous, or part from Africa and part from Turtle Island. And part of it is preventing the erasure of the Middle Passage. My grandmother, Philomena, escaped slavery in 1750, pregnant with her master's child. I have the birth certificate from the birth of her mother, which is a scrap of paper, or not her mother, her daughter, which is a scrap of paper with the daughter's name and Philomena's name and race writ on it. And DNA wise, I can trace her to the Sudan. So her life, the things that she went through, the Middle Passage that she came over on, all of those things are important, and all of those things need to not be erased. The rich, beautiful history within Africa that spans from the north to the south, that is the first civilizations, that is the first people. These are all beautiful, rich connections that I get from having that ancestry, that anybody that has that ancestry gets. That doesn't mean that I'm Black, and it doesn't mean that I am Sudanese, right? Sudanese being a nation, and obviously Black is a skin color, and I am not, right? Well, I have that ancestry. I'm too light to even be, I don't have to deal with the shit that comes along with that within this culture, right? So within that, we have to look at the fact that there is this rich and beautiful culture and ancestry that people are erasing for themselves and erasing for other people and removing for other people when they try to replace Turtle Island Indigenous people with Black people and try to say that Black people are in fact Turtle Island Indigenous people, and Turtle Island Indigenous people are half Black, half white, but they're Europeans. This erasure of Turtle Island Indigenous people is horrific. Why would we work to erase different marginalized ethnicities or groups? Why would anybody do that? Why are we doing the God King's job for them? Why are we maintaining their power for them? Othering is to maintain power so somebody can rob you blind. Why are you participating in maintaining power to let somebody else rob you blind by deciding to erase an entire group of people that the white people have been trying to erase for 500 fucking years? Why are you doing their job for them? Why? You can't merge into something if you're asked not to. You can be adopted in, absolutely. You can't merge two things, especially when one's saying no, that's without consent. And you're never going to find a space with an Indigenous community that you're not welcomed, as long as you're not trying to replace or erase. One of the primary identified problems throughout history as to why Turtle Island Indigenous people ended up facing the genocide they did is because of how kind and welcoming they are. You're never going to enter into a space where you're told to get the fuck out unless you're trying to erase, speak over, or fuck with people. Right? That's just wrong, John. What does your grandmother tell you about your nation? What did your grandmother tell you about your nation? And what did your grandmother tell you about your creation story? Nobody who's descended to the Olmec says that of the Olmec. Have you asked a Mayan person that? I'm not a $5 Indian. I didn't claim any belonging to any nation. I'm also not a pretendian, and I'm not a Wabo. It was bad, isn't it? I'm going to let you all read that. That's Columbus in 1493. This, by the way, is content from a Black creator who's sick and tired of your bullshit and erasure. Again, this live is because an Afro-Indigenous creator, again, African and Indigenous creator, asked because they're sick and tired of this bullshit. You are creating issues for everybody. You're erasing all of my grandmothers. You're erasing your grandmothers. You're erasing other people. Your grandmother would she would not be proud of you. She would not be proud of you unless she was a white supremacist and was cheering you on for doing the white supremacist work, because that's what you're doing. That's what you're doing. And if I have to sit here with this picture up and just repeat to you over and over again to read the goddamn thing and what the DNA is, I will over and over again. See, I was given a privilege, unfortunately for me. I don't appreciate this privilege. I don't like this privilege, but I've used this privilege. I was taught from the very first breaths that I drew that I was Black and that I was Indigenous and that I was Celtic. Okay. I was taught about my grandmother's experience passing. I was taught by her grandchild who raised my grandma or my mother. Okay. I was taught of what happened to my Indigenous grandmothers. Okay. And I was taught this from my first breath. There was never any idea that slavery didn't happen. There was never any idea in my head. I stood up in kindergarten and told the teacher she didn't know what the fuck she was talking about because I was learning to read from archaeological texts. Okay. There was never an idea in my head that slavery hadn't happened, that there wasn't a huge difference between indentured servitude and slavery, chattel slavery. Okay. There was never any thought in my mind that the massacres within Turtle Island hadn't happened, that the residential schools that I had family members who had gone to hadn't happened. Okay. This privilege afforded me tools. This privilege meant that I got to move within certain communities, whether I liked it or not, because I got ostracized from communities that I didn't look enough like. And so sometimes the only communities there were the white communities, as horrid as they were. And as much as I sat on the outside and watched going, ooh, okay. But that privilege afforded me the ability to get different educational tools that aren't granted in different ways and to get into different spaces. And because of that, and because of those tools, I'm sharing that information. because we should all know it. Do you know that they are teaching in schools in the South that slavery was Black people being brought here from Africa? Uh, oh, I can't even say it out loud. That Black people were brought here for a better life and given a better life here in America. That they were transported, and to pay for their transport, they worked it off in fields, and nobody was harmed in this. And they were given food and clothing and treated kindly by the white people who had enslaved them. That's what they teach in schools in the South. And you want to decide to remove that and erase it? They teach that Turtle Island Indigenous people have disappeared. We are museum exhibits. Do you remember walking through museums at 5 and 10 and seeing Turtle Island Indigenous people and mock-ups like Neanderthals? They taught we went extinct and we are still here. And you are helping them. You are helping them. So why you are out there helping the white fuckheads? And so you know, white is not your indigeneity, your cultural heritage. It has nothing to do with who you are. It's something that you have chosen to wear to get that privilege. If you look like me, you can be anything from Celtic to Icelandic to Italian. You have heritage and ancestors to love, to worship, to follow, to be a part of. We all do. We all have an indigenous space that we are from, just like people from Africa have an indigenous space that they are from. We all have that indigenous space. To say that the people in this indigenous space no longer exist is to do the white people's job for them, to do the rich 1% who is trying to keep you in check so that they can exploit the last bit of you until they ditch you for the fucking street. You are participating and you are helping that. So as long as you're going to come into my space and spew your erasure of multiple groups of people and your white supremacist bullshit talking points, I'm going to repeatedly tell you, you're wrong. Come with some knowledge. Come correct, because your grandmother would be ashamed of you. I said it and I meant it. Your grandmother would be ashamed of you for erasing somebody else's grandmother to do the white man's job for him. This is true. And the reasoning is because if you put white on that census, then you are more likely to succeed within this structure, because the entire structure within the Americas is built on and founded on racism. Race theory was invented to double it down, to justify it. It's all built on the idea that God marked Cain's children with dark skin. And because God marked Cain's children with dark skin, they were meant to serve the white race. And again, race has been debunked. Race doesn't exist. But they sure thought it did. Well, they didn't think of it as race then. They thought it is the mark of Cain, right? And it translates down into race when they develop race theory, when they decide that evolution is real, which it is. And they have to have a reason to justify the atrocities that they have been committing. And as long as they have a reason to justify the atrocities that they have been committing, right, they're going to double it down in this entire structure. This entire structure is based on wiping out groups of people. Wiping out groups of people and maintaining other groups of people in some form of bondage so that you can sit on your high horse, so that you can sit in your security in your hoard. because that's all it is. It's a horde. Nobody needs a dick-shaped rocket to fly to the fucking moon. Nobody. Nobody. It's a horde. Come on. Right? So, as long as you're supporting that, right? And it is all based everything. I mean, so there is evidence that some Turtle Island indigenous people from the west coast of South America have later Polynesian DNA. But what I was talking about earlier is not evidence that Turtle Island indigenous people are related to Pacific Islanders. Currently, I disagree with this, but currently the belief is that Pacific Islanders are a later group coming in. They believe this because most of the islands have only been there for a couple of thousand years, and those people were only there for a couple of thousand years because the island's only been there for a couple of thousand years, but there's entire continents that were above water at the end of the last ice age, right? Um, and so currently the belief is that the Pacific Islanders are mainly groups coming through within the last 7,000 years, whereas Turtle Island indigenous people have been here for at least 30,000 years. And the look at the boat route is putting the boat route as the southern boat route, looking at 30,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, which would be what current archaeology is stating is before the settling of the Pacific Islands by the current Pacific Island groups. So the DNA is that we see that is similar in South America along the west coast is believed to be a later DNA influx. I believe that they're stating that that's like 2,000 to 3,000 years old, but I'm not exactly sure what the dating is on that one for how long it was within it. But the boat route, the Denisovian, the Neanderthal, they're not seeing that that's so much that that's a relation between DNA. They're just looking at Pacific Islander DNA. What they're looking at is the DNA of the Neanderthals and the Denisovians, specifically the Denisovian DNA specifically still within that area, because where we see Denisovian DNA still is within Southeast Asia and Australia and the Pacific Islands. And so they're like, well, the Denisovian DNA is there and the Denisovian DNA is here. So it makes sense that they're coming through this space. I don't even want to scroll back up through that set of questions. It just got really bad up there, I know. And I can't, like, we're in the midst of another huge fucking outbreak, right? Of knowledge of a tragedy that has happened. And I'm having a hard time with it. I refuse to watch it. But because I'm having a hard time with it, some of this other stuff becomes much harder for me. Most people don't know that Chauvin killed 2 indigenous men and a black man before he killed George Floyd. This issue is cross-cultural. This issue is hitting all of us. And it is really the issue that is within that structural racism within our country. Our first policing is sheriffs, right? Because our first policings are sheriffs appointed by kings to govern spaces. And then, here within the United States, this translates down to our early slave catcher police forces. And the racism that is so inherent within the structure and in the government. They've done studies, anthropological studies. I was lucky enough that by the time I got into school for archaeology and anthropology, I was in my 40s. And it was populated by a lot of indigenous women and a lot I have a teacher who was from India and a teacher who was Chinese and a teacher who was just different ethnicities from around different spaces who were able to bring in different prospects and understandings And so because of that, all of that, like, they brought in all of this newer knowledge. And so one of the studies I was fortunate enough to get to read is the study that they did on policing, right? And the archaeological and anthropological studies of police culture, right? And the racism that's inherent within police culture, and the idea of, the verbiage that creates this idea that people who are darker of skin are all the same, and that they are all somehow more violent, right? And this verbiage within that policing culture, right? Of course, we know it's all false, but the verbiage itself is not, and the culture within that is actually what's going on, right? But we know race is false, and we know these things are false. But just because we know it doesn't mean that the police culture has got it. I mean, look at these lives where we see hate after hate after hate after hate that just doesn't, like, stop, right? Like, there's always somebody out there who is willing to believe in hate first, usually couched in some terms about how moral and ethical they are, but there's always somebody out there willing to believe in hate first, right? There's always going to be somebody out there willing to do it. And so, as we're dealing with this, instead of focusing on these people who are killing Black and brown people, who are killing Indigenous people and Black people, who are killing all of our groups, instead of focusing on that shit, you want to argue on whether or not you should be able to erase an entire culture, or several different entire cultures, because let's face it is several different entire cultures. Like, why would you do that? Why are we not focused on the problem? Why are we not focused on the true horror? This idea that a certain group could be less than or subject to another group. Why are we still more willing to believe in self hatred than in our own beauty and in the beauty of the people around us? Because that's really what that boils down to, is such a deep feeling of disconnect that you've got to claim somebody else's connection instead of finding your own and working together to ensure that nobody ever is disconnected like that again. Most people aren't aware that the genocide of Turtle Island Indigenous people is still ongoing, that they ended forced hysterectomies the year I was born in 78. And yet I know women my age who were subjected to forced hysterectomies and forced sterilization. They just do it in a different way. They take your children now unless you give permission, right? So it's forced permission. There is 120 communities of Turtle Island Indigenous people without running water or access to any water. 120 communities within the United States borders who do not have water. Warm Springs in Oregon is one of them. Last year before in Oregon, we hit 116 in the summer. Imagine being in 116-degree weather without access to water. Imagine being without access to water in the middle of a global pandemic, right? Children are still being taken from homes based on Western thought's idea of how they should be parented. We are living in the middle of an ongoing genocide. And if you're contributing to it by deciding that people don't exist, you're helping the white guys commit genocide. You're helping the colonizers commit genocide. Yeah, I think that's the last wave. There's waves that are constant. Like it starts at 30,000 years ago, but the idea that it was ever isolated is kind of ridiculous. We've always been global. And Arctic people, I mean, the North Pole is tiny. Why would Arctic people not be able to move? They're already moving all along that. Why would they not be able to move, right? That's where we need to we have asked that those who look like me, when told that an action is racist, instead of going, I'm not racist, they go, how? Help me do better, right? This has been a request from Black and Indigenous communities, from communities of color here in, well, in many communities of color across the globe. Stop saying, no, I'm not. Say how. Acknowledge it, understand it so you can change it, right? We talk a lot about allies and accomplices, and this is an extremely important thing. What we're failing, though, is that we all have space to be allies and accomplices. We all have space to be allies and accomplices of somebody else that we're not a part of. There are a bunch of marginalized communities across our country right now, not just based on race, but based on gender, based on sexuality. And again, race is a construct, it's a colonial construct. It does not biologically exist. Ethnicity does, but it does not biologically exist race. But based on this racist system, we have many different groups who have been marginalized, have been put into different spaces. And when we, as one group, are working to forward ourselves, we are going to do better forwarding ourselves if we are working with the other groups who are trying to overturn this hate thought process, this idea that you can tell me who I am, right? Instead of my ancestors telling me who I am, that you identify me instead of my community identifying me, right? If we can overthrow this, and if we can get rid of this idea of othering, that because you belong to another group, therefore I should hate you and you're the problem, not the guys up there that are trying to steal and exploit from me, but it's you, right? If we can get through that and all become accomplices for each other, move each other's groups forward, then we can get rid of this system that is keeping us all down here. And it doesn't matter how you want to identify it. It doesn't matter what verbiage you want to use. And I'm not saying that verbiage is not important, because it's very important. I'm just saying I don't care how you identify it in your mind to get it to work. But instead of erasing other groups of people, what we should be doing is going, I didn't realize that that's what I was doing. I apologize for that, but what do I need to do to change that? Not apologize, but I apologize for that. And I need to know what I need to do to change that to move forward, right? I need to know how I can make sure that you're not erased, right? When somebody identifies to you that you are doing something that hurts or harms them, whether it's a slur, whether it's physical, whether it's not saying no, whether it's looking at them, whether it's touching them, when somebody identifies, I don't like that, don't do that, we stop. That's what healthy, respectful people do. And if that's not what you're doing, you're using narcissistic tools. When you've decided that you know better than a person knows about their own community, you're using the colonizer's tools and you're using narcissistic tools. And when somebody says you're hurting me and you say, no, I'm not, you should just not be hurt and let me replace you anyways. You're using a narcissistic tool system that was given to you by the people who harmed us all. And they gave it to you so that you could help them maintain their superiority and you maintain your ditch. That's it. Stop helping people maintain their ditch or your ditch, right? Why are you building somebody else's horde by erasing a group of people instead of joining with them to get rid of that horde or spread it out a bit, right? I'm only going to stay around for about another half an hour. My physical being this week is not very good. My disabilities have been pretty heavy. Um, so I'm only going to go a little bit longer. I went ahead and turned the comments back on so people can talk. I need to get myself out of space for just a second so I can medicate without doing it on TikTok live, um, because the pain is starting to get slightly overwhelming. You might be following me over on YouTube, I'm sure, but YouTube doesn't care. And apparently the phone is blocking YouTube anyways. Absolutely. This is not my normal content. Normally we talk about paleoanthropology and who we are prior to Christian colonization. This was requested, and one thing that I try and do is make sure that the tools that I got due to privilege are used to help uplift siblings and um, create knowledge, right? Thank you. My nose rings itchy now. Everybody was talking about it. No, well, and I've had to learn not to. So I usually, like I said, this is usually taught conversations about paleoanthropology and human evolution, and it's usually very it's usually very rife with trolls, and so very frequently I have to. It took a while. I have had more mods than you're supposed to have. They made me get rid of mods, and then I ended up just having to lock it down. Usually I have to lock it down most of the live because it doesn't matter what the topic is. I'm not sure why. It just gets very, very trolly in here. You're welcome, everyone. This is probably the last time we'll go live on this subject specifically. I thought about I don't know if anybody's seen, but oh, I'm mixing two names. I think it's Brown Girl Pride, but I'm not sure if I'm mixing that with another name now or not. But she did one on a infant skull from 12 million years ago. That's like the last common ancestor between us and the great apes. And so I almost brought that in tonight, but I hadn't done this as a nighttime live, and I did want to make sure that I got this on both daytime and nighttime. We do know the Mayas and the Incas are still around. That's part of what we were talking about a bit, Chante. Currently, the oldest sapien find is 33,000 years in a cave near where the Mayas were. Um, and they've also recently, and like I said, I don't typically like toss up a lot of Turtle Island indigenous stuff or really look into a lot of Turtle Island indigenous stuff unless I see it proving oral history is true. But I did see that there was this thing that came across recently about they did a topography, or not topography, that LiDAR thing, and they discovered a Mayan city that's like 3,000 years old. It's really cool. Absolutely firecracker. Um, no, I would never quote Columbus. This is showing what Columbus is stating about the people he found, and why this is important is because people are stating that he found a different people. They currently push back the oldest sapien find, but I don't know if it was a skull. They push it back to 300,000 years ago, and it's somewhere in Africa, but I'm not exactly sure where it is in Africa. So all of the stuff that I have talked about tonight has sources. They're all Western sources, and they're all sources that you can get to without having to go through a paywall. Um, but they're all underneath. They're all on nwiddaord.com, my website, and they're all underneath the Turtle Island Indigenous Finds for Turtle Island Indigenous People tab. Yes, genre, the Khoi people of South Africa. This is true. They're one of the two groups that do not have um, Neanderthal DNA. The Khoi people and the Oyo people. Oyo people of West Africa, but they have three ghost species DNA in them. The Olmec are not African. The Olmec are Turtle Island indigenous. This is going to pause me for a second. The Olmec are Turtle Island indigenous. The Olmec are precursors to the Mayan. I'm not sure what you're asking me, Valentino. No, I'm not wrong. I've got degrees in archaeology and anthropology, and I'm Turtle Island indigenous, raised on stories of who we were. So, yes, Matashengo, that is most likely Homo erectus, because at 130,000 years ago, no Homo sapiens were out of Africa, and we are all Homo sapiens because we can all breed. Um, but 130,000 years ago would have been Homo erectus speciating into a species here, like they did with Neanderthal and Denisovian and Florensis and Lonzensis and Longi and Nalati elsewhere around the globe, and also in or Australia. And so that would be the ghost species that we see in Turtle Island indigenous DNA that we don't see anywhere else. How is the oldest Y chromosome 250,000 years old? Because we are 300,000 years old as a species. So, of course, 50,000 years after we become a species, there would be Y chromosome from us, right? And this is why we turn the comments off. So I'm going to keep it on for about 2 more hot seconds, and then we'll see if we keep them on. I might be the missing link. I'm a little bit of everything and everyone. Which in many different cultures is actually described as that missing link that kind of, gets it all. So Uh, all of the North American continent, which includes Mexico down to the tip. If you look at it, hold on. This is going to pause me again. This is Turtle Island. What color is copper color? Copper. There's an undertone to so Turtle Island from north to south has many different actual skin tones, like shadings from pretty pale up far north in the Arctic to pretty dark along the equator, but they all have kind of a copper tone to them, undertone to them. Same in Asia, where you get very light far north and very dark far south, but you still have kind of that golden undertone to them. That's cool. Cool. Yes, genre. Um, the preferred spelling on that, so that verbiage that you're using is considered to be a slur. The correct spelling is KhweXan. And it's understood that people who are not raised with the click cannot pronounce it correctly. And so it's preferred to use, instead of the XAN half, because the X stands for click, to use the KHWE, which is Quay, pronounced kind of, to my understanding, almost like a K with a way after it, Quay, but it's a little bit more of a G sound to it too. Or Abath, Abathwa, instead of the BANTU word that is used often, which is also considered to be a slur, just so you're aware. Well, what we think of as Caucasian today is actually, so Caucasian is actually North African and the Levant area, all the way up into the Caucasus Mountains. It's the Caucasus region. Um, n- um, Nordic is what we kind of think of. Um, Northern European is that ultralight translucent. That comes from adaptation, but that's pretty recent. Like, we see that people in Europe are pretty dark skin up until about, well, even 10,000 years ago, they're relatively dark skin across the population. And then roughly 5,000 years ago, they start getting lighter. And then 2,000 years ago, you're seeing maybe 70 to 80% of the population is relatively lighter. And then by 1,000 years ago, even the sagas talk about Egil having dark skin. So dark skin or light skin is actually pretty recent, even within Europe. What do I think about climate change? Climate change happens. It's like a natural cycle within the planet. Climate destruction is what Western agriculture causes when it comes in and rips up entire biomes. Western thought and greed kind of rip out a bunch of shit from the earth, and all of this causes climate destruction. And climate destruction is causing a depletion of our oxygen, a melting of our polar caps. It might cause the extinction of our species and many other species. And if that's the case, then we'll be the only species stupid enough to mass extinct ourselves. So much for our own great intelligence. I agree with that, Adam. To me, it's more gold than anything else. And I often say I'm not white, I'm gold, because if you look at me, I'm actually pretty gold, but that's because I'm so very mixed, I think. But my skin is very golden. Western thought is absolutely white people, though it comes from the Middle East and the Levant area. Kind of starts in the Nile, but then it really solidifies in the Levant area with stratification. Actually, I'm indigenous, not white. And I'm actually globally mixed. I have light skin and I am white assumed, but I am not white. I'm gold, damn it, I'm gold. Thank you guys. That's so The Levant area is Canaanite, like right up outside of Egypt. Jerusalem is the Levant area, kind of in that mountain. And I'm geographically challenged, so I can't remember all the current cities there, but it's what we often call the cradle of civilization. Ur is in that area. This is where early farming starts. Though actually all of that stuff comes from Egypt. Like we see 15,000 years ago, the start of planting along the Nile, well, not the start of husbanding wheat and barley along the Nile, in a very indigenous agriculture. And it's when it's turned into Western thought process of transplanting it, ripping out an entire biome, and then planting something in rows that remove all nutrients from the area around it. That we start to see it come about a little differently. Oh, I don't think that there's anything inherently wrong with being okay. So, white is not a culture, it's not an ethnicity. Um, European is Irish or Celtic. Irish is a nationality, so Celtic. Germanic, Italian. These things are all cultures. They're all ethnicities. White is not an ethnicity. White is a privilege. It is putting you in a classification within a structure that has deemed us all something or another that has nothing to do with our ethnicity, right? Um, that's not why I don't say I'm white. For whoever's saying the all you stuff, I'm raised and born Turtle Island Indigenous. So, but so uh, but white is white is the unique culture within Western thought that provides the idea of dominance for having lighter skin, um, and living within that culture. Now, you can be light of skin and be no other heritage but European and identify as Germanic instead of white, right? Um, but when you're identifying as white, when you're working within the exploitative culture and the provision of otherism, that is the problem. Western thought and that otherism and that provision of privilege that comes with having skin that looks like this is the problem. Not having European heritage, which is a beautiful heritage groups. There's several beautiful heritage groups in Europe, right? There's several current indigenous groups fighting for freedom from colonization. The Kumri, the Welsh people or the Kumri people, Ken Ken Kenwek, the Sami people, right? There are many other groups. Ukrainian people are currently an indigenous group fighting colonization and for sovereignty within their own land, who have been there and are indigenous to that space, right? So there are lots of groups that are fighting that look like this across the globe, right? It is completely a different thing to be white. Why does it disconnect from your ancestry and your heritage? Race is made up to divide and conquer every minute of that, every minute of that. And race has been debunked. Race doesn't exist. It's a colonial construct to keep you underneath their thumb so that they can rule you, so that you're fighting each other, so that they can exploit you and starve you and kill you. That's all it is. We all have culture. We all have culture. If you live in a diaspora where you're disconnected from your culture, and that's the problem that we're talking about tonight, right? If you're living in a diaspora where you are disconnected from your culture, whether that is a choice that your ancestors made or a choice that was imposed upon them, right? Right? Imposed upon them, right? Whether or not your ancestors made that choice or your ancestors were stolen from their homeland does not make the difference. You're living within a diaspora, and trying to reconnect to your ancestry can be done, right? Can absolutely be done. It is when you are trying to replace somebody else's ancestry that it becomes problematic, right? And this is if you're a pretendian or if you're going wabo. It doesn't fucking matter. If you are pretending and you're not stating that the culture doesn't exist, you are just trying to be a part of it when you don't belong to it, right? And there are better ways to go about that because you can be accepted within a culture without belonging to it. So if you feel indigenous and you don't have any indigenous ancestry and you really want to work for indigenous communities and belong to community, you can do that without claiming ancestry. You just have to work for and become a part, right? Um, and replacing it with an outside culture, right? And stating that it didn't exist anymore is a problem as well, because it's replacing it, right? When you're more than welcome to join it and to be a part, you're going to be welcomed in if you just stop trying to replace it, right? So if you don't want to go that way and you want to go to your ancestry, there's rich ancestry in all spaces that all the people within this diaspora that we are in come from, or any diaspora. We all have an indigenous space on this planet that we have indigenous connection to, that we understand the meaning of the trees in our bones. Epigenetics is real. Your ancestor's story is written in your bones. And if your ancestor's story is written in your bones, right, then you understand your ancestor's space when you were within it. So if your ancestors' history is written in your bones and your ancestors come from France, then instead of burning sage, you lavender, because the plant speaks to your ancestors in a way that the white sage from the West Coast, where it only grows, isn't going to. We all have rich indigenous heritage everywhere. I am globally mixed indigenous. Indigenous is Turtle Island indigenous, but it is also all those other globally mixed cultures because I come from every space, right? Because that is what happens in this diaspora, right? I was watching something today when they were going over Black celebrities' DNA, and they were talking about how many people who are African heritage, their DNA is not just from one group, but from many different groups because of that mix that happens within that diaspora. So if you're trying to find your indigenous heritage and you're like, well, I don't know what part of Africa my indigenous heritage is from, so I have a hard time with that, it is likely that your indigenous heritage is from more than one space within Africa, and that you can work within a couple of different spaces within Africa, which is much better than stating that indigenous Turtle Islanders don't exist and that you are indigenous to Turtle Island, right? You gotta figure out what the indigenous heritage is one way or another. Why not go to your ancestors' peoples instead of trying to replace somebody else? It's getting bad again, isn't it? I'm so sorry. I know I got to talking and I wasn't paying any attention. I apologize. Hold on just a second. It's going to pause me for a hot moment. We don't get to choose our own culture. Culture belongs to more than just you, or it's not culture, it's identity. You get to choose your own identity, but you don't get to choose your culture. Culture is something that is bigger than you. So you have to be chosen by it as much as you choose it. You don't get to dictate it to everybody else. Like, that's like going into a club and saying you belong, right? Like, nobody gets to walk into a club and say they belong. You don't get to God, there's so many arguments about this in so many spaces already, right? You don't get to decide that you're something when it's belonging to a group that exists, right? That is stating, no, you're not. Just don't. I don't know why people are angry about the Dawes rolls. And not being indigenous and being angry about the Dawes rolls. Like, so all humans come from black DNA. So we all come from Africa, absolutely. But every time you say things like all humans come from black DNA and all humans come from black people, what you're stating is that I have the right to all things black. You're stating I'm black. Yet half the time you're going to state I'm not. So yes, we all come from Africa. But if you've been out of Africa for 30,000 years, your culture and your heritage and your ethnicity is no longer African. Your culture and your heritage and your ethnicity has changed. Otherwise, can we all wear box braids? We're all black. You're stating there's no such thing as culture that people get to hold themselves. Thank you, Sava. You're right. Everybody who initially inhabited Europe was black. Again, we see that Cheddar Man and the group of people that he was with, which is about the mitochondrial DNA of 13% of Europe, were black. And what this means is the phenotype of their skin has been deemed as the same phenotype that we see in sub-Saharan Africa. Um, my understanding of alleles and skin tone is not the fucking best, so I might not be saying it in the exactly correct way of whether or not it's phenotypes or alleles or whatever else, but it is dictated as sub-Saharan African. He had blue eyes, and it's thought that most of the group did as well. His direct descendant is a mile from where he was found, right? 300 generations after, which I think is pretty cool. But we see that this is the vast majority of the population of Europe until about 6,000 years ago, when we see that roughly 50% of the population is probably getting lighter of skin. Again, we're not looking at dark, 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 and light, 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 light. We're looking at just this kind of mix coming down. Same thing with Neanderthals. Same thing with people coming out of Africa at the same time. The gene for light skin is 900,000 years old, and it comes from Africa. Just saying. Okay. So when we're looking at this, we're seeing that roughly 2,000 years ago, you're looking at about 70 to 80% of the population of Northern Europe is light of skin. And then roughly 1,000 years ago, during the Viking Age, you're looking at it roughly 90% of the population is light of skin. Even Egil from the sagas is talked about as being dark of skin, as is half of his family. And it is known now that Scandinavia, settled at 7,000 years ago, is settled by two groups. One who is dark of skin and light of eye, and one who is light of skin and dark of eye, which translates to the population of the Sami people presently, who are a unique group who come over with a unique language from the Finno-Ugric steppes and then come over and up roughly at the same time. So Is race not just a word for ratios of DNA? Doesn't matter what you call it. No, not really. So race dictates that dependent on your phenotype of skin, hair, and eye, and certain body morphology and where you're from depends on whether or not you're intelligent, whether or not you're good at sports, whether or not you feel pain. Uh, it is why we have the highest here in the United States have the highest maternal mortality rate of the industrialized world, and that is primarily in Black women, because we currently believe that Black women don't feel pain, and so we don't listen to them. And so uh, that is what race says. That's what race does, and that's why we've debunked it. Now, mitochondrial lines, family lines, certain genetics that pass through certain family lines absolutely exist. But we know that there's more genetic differences within populations, like the Quay people are the most genetically diverse population on the planet. This is also how we know that we came from that group, is because they have all the genes of all the Homo sapiens. Like every Homo sapien gene you could possibly want is within the Quay people in South Africa. So we know that we're more genetically diverse within populations than we are between populations. And this is how we know that race doesn't exist, right? Because genetic diversity is greater within populations, which makes sense because we are all avoiding inbreeding. Okay. You want to be genetically diverse for from your neighbors so your children can have babies, right? Um, so, uh, ratios for DNA, it doesn't really apply to that, right? Because it doesn't look at the genes at all. It looks at specifically the skin phenotype. That's all it looks at. It's literally all it looks at is what color is your skin and where might your ancestors have come from. I'm trying to look back and see. You can be white and be Mexican. Spanish people are light of skin and light of eye and light of hair. Spanish people are descendant from Celtic people. They're a Celtic group. That is until you see the Moors, who are a mix of North African Islam and Middle Eastern Islamic groups, which is who the Moors are. They're a blended group. They're a Muslim group that's consisting of those two groups that comes into Spain and takes over for 200 years and then is driven out. Horrifically, and the Spanish Inquisition is literally one of the worst atrocities on this planet. But uh, the Spanish people overall are very light skin and light of hair. You will see certain spaces where you'll get a little bit darker skin, kind of a Mediterranean skin tone, which we identify as Caucasian, actually, again, North African and the Levant area and the Arabian Peninsula is all identified as Caucasian. In fact, you go to Iraq or Iran or Kuwait, and they will tell you they are Caucasian. Um, and up into up Turkey, Turkey geographically might just challenge sometimes, but up to the Caucasus Mountains. Um, so you're going to see that some people in Spain are going to be a little bit darker, but overall they're very light of skin, light of hair, and light of eye. So very many groups of people from Mexico are absolutely light of skin and light of hair and light of eye because they're carrying a heavier percentage of Spanish genetics within them, which means that they're getting those lighter tones within them, not having time to adapt to an area, taking 100 generations or 2,500 years for Homo sapiens to adapt to an area. Okay. Don't even know why we're talking about God. That's awesome talk. I was wondering about your all food. Okay, I'm not going into the rest of it. It's a little bit lots today. My name is Sarah, and if you are in here now, you may have missed the first part. Um, I call myself a Widda. It's a title. Widda is the Celtic indigenous term from ancient Gaelic, meaning knowledge, wid of the feminine, duh, and it is the feminine half of the druid, drew meaning oak, and wid meaning knowledge. I identify this because when I was 12 and started looking at my other heritage outside of my Black heritage and my Indigenous heritage, I went first to my Celtic heritage that I knew of, and so I've been studying my Celtic heritage since I was about 12. And, this came to me in a book that was given to me called The Druids, that is a linguistic study of ancient Proto Indo European language done by Peter Beresford Ellis, who is a doctorate of linguistic paleoanthropology, when I was 20 for my first marriage. um, so I personally am a globally mixed Indigenous person. My indigeneity, I was raised within Turtle Island indigeneity, within Turtle Island Indigenous community within the Pacific Northwest. Um, for my early childhood, my grandmother Nani was Red Paint Clan Eastern Band Cherokee. My grandmother Polly was Miwok, though her children were registered Quapaw. Um, and my grandmother, uh, sorry, I'm picturing Dora Dolly, and it's not Dora Dolly, and she's the one in my head right now, but my grandmother, Flindra, um, her grandmother, was escaped slavery in 1750, pregnant with her master's child. And DNA says that she was from the Sudan. I am globally mixed because when I look at my DNA and when I trace all of my family lines, both the ones that I was taught as a child and the ones that I've researched myself as an adult, they literally come from every space. And I have put in a lot of study and effort in most of those spaces, per request from my elders, my personal elders, and others within my community. I teach people how to decolonize their European heritage without appropriating other people's culture. I was asked to hold space on what pre-European contact Turtle Island looked like, by an Afro-Indigenous person, because this conflict between these two communities that is trying to erase one of the communities is painful for people who are a mixed of both of the communities. I do know that many Afro-Indigenous people are often told, "Well, you're not Afro-Indigenous. You're either Indigenous or you're African," right? Because of this, right? Because it's automatically thought that that's where they're going, when it's very hard to be mixed within these communities. I know it's light, but I feel it, right? It's very hard to be mixed within these communities, and it's a very exclusionary feeling sometimes for those of us who are very diverse or mixed. So um, it's very hard to be this kind of like midway point between two different communities when the two different communities are kind of like going at each other. So I totally understood why they asked, and I totally was willing. Right, this is not usually what I do. Uh, I mean, I don't teach Turtle Island Indigenous history. It's not my lane. I'm not a culture keeper. I'm not a member of a nation. Right. Family claims to be, but no nation claims me, right? So it's not my lane. I often will find things and give it up so people can know when I see histories that I know, oral histories that I know proven true by archaeology or anthropology or things like that, so that I can give tools to people, right? But not so that I can teach people, just to confirm for people things that I know that they know, right? So that they can confirm it to the white supremacists who are trying to divide us all. I spent a year in a Muslim camp as a child. So I learned Iranian heritage from like 7 to 8, right? Um, I have been around so many different cultures all my life that I have heard so many different things and I've learned so many different things, and I try and bring that in. Um, so many of us have been harmed by this othering, and it doesn't really matter what side of the othering you're on. It's killing us. Young men are the highest rate of unaliving in the United States. Self-unaliving, right? Um, because of rape culture, which isn't quite what you think it when you think it, right? Like, you're like, well, why would, women being put in harm's way all the time cause young men to unalive themselves at higher rates, right? Well, it's because young men are taught that they can't be vulnerable, that they can't have feelings because they can't talk. They're not taught what no is, right? That's why, because they live in this state of disconnect that gives them no sense of community and no sense of security, and this idea that they have to be some form of alpha male that doesn't exist, because that's only something that happens in captivity when you're trying to protect your genetically diverse band of people from all over the gosh dang globe that were forced into one captive space together from the predators that are holding you captive. That's where alpha comes in. So you're not supposed to be an alpha. It's not right to be an alpha, right? But you're taught to be an alpha. And you're taught that you're supposed to never show feeling and never show fear, but you're supposed to be owed a good woman. As long as you're a good man, somebody should give you, right? Harms us all. Shit harms us all. And when you are erasing an entire group of people and replacing them with yourself, you're harming all of us. You're harming yourself because your ancestors aren't going to hear you. You're trying to become an ancestor worshiper, speaking to your ancestors in a language that they can't understand, about a place that they don't know. Can you hear that? Nani never spoke English. I can't speak to Nani in English. She never spoke English. I cannot talk to Nani about Europe and have her feel anything other than suppression, right? If I am talking to Eleanor from Scotland and I am bringing in white sage from the West Coast to talk to her and speaking to her in the tongue of her conquerors, she can't hear me, right? If you are talking to your great grandmother in the tongue of the people who enslaved her about plants that she'd never understood, that were not hers, she's not going to be able to hear you because you will be a stranger to her. On the other hand, if you identify a language that is at least similar to hers and a biome and plants that are similar to the ones that she would have known, then when you leave offerings to her or you speak to her, she will hear your language. She will understand you. This is why people learn their language, so that their ancestors will hear them when they speak, right? When you go to your grandmother and speak to her of a creation story that she did not know, she does not hear you. But if you go to your grandmother and speak to her of a creation story that she knew, that she felt, that her grandmother spoke to her around the fire, then she will hear you. This does not just harm us, it erases us. It's really shitty of you to do the white man's job for him, but it doesn't just harm us. It harms your connection because you can't form that connection. You're calling her by the wrong name. You're speaking to her in the wrong voice. And the songs that you sing are not her birds. The food that you give her is not the food she ate. And you cannot correctly identify those things until you identify at least some form of the space that she came from. I know that that can be hard, and I'm not stating that that isn't sad, that it's hard, and I'm not trying to erase that fact. And I'll give you all the help, and I know plenty of Indigenous groups who will give you all the help in the world to find that connection, right? We realize the pain of colonization too. We realize the pain of erasure too. We're just asking you not to erase us, to alleviate your own pain of erasure. We will help alleviate your pain of erasure. Just stop erasing us, because it will never alleviate your pain of erasure to erase us. You will never find your grandmother talking to our grandmothers. This is my last live on this. I'd hope to be able to have a few people up, but it's been a little bit trolly tonight. You'll go back to Paleoanth when we come back Tuesday, probably around 10 a.m. I'll go ahead and turn this on for a little bit before I leave. But then I'm just going to go ahead and take off in a couple minutes just because it's getting late and it gets to be a lot. As I do that, I'd like to remind everybody that A, we should not be erasing other groups of people, and B, we have other fucking fights. As videos have been released recently that we should all be mourning and partaking in the eradication of a system that allows this to happen, we should stop erasing each other and focus on that. There's a bigger fight out there. Don't let them do their job for you. Don't do their job for them. You can tell I'm out. My pain is getting too high. Don't do their job for them. We've got a whole fucking system that's trying to kill us all. We've got a whole system that's trying to kill us all. And they're trying to exploit every last bit of you. Don't let them. Don't participate in it. Be an ally to somebody, an accomplice to somebody, because we all have space to be allies and accomplices. Right? And remember that our true sense is community. Our true sense of self is nurture and community. It is this disconnect that is harming us, that is hurting us, that is causing this deep pain within us all. It is this deep pain within us all that this othering is causing. Can you imagine what would happen if we united instead of arguing over who, instead of trying to erase a group, if we united and worked together? Some guy's out there talking about going into court to get his land back, telling an indigenous person that. And it's like, imagine if we all went to court together to get indigenous people's land back and settled into that governance, right? Like, what if we were united in it? I do understand that all people who are darker of skin are not from Africa. I am actually double downing on the fact that not all people who are dark of skin are from Africa. The groups who are descendant of Africans who are in Turtle Island today claiming to be Turtle Island indigenous when they're of African descent is who we are talking about. Groups that are not in Turtle Island indigenous groups that are claiming to be Turtle Island indigenous groups who are very melanated groups. And Turtle Island indigenous groups are very melanated groups, but they are absolutely on all level Turtle Island indigenous. They've always been Turtle Island indigenous. They've always looked Turtle Island indigenous. Turtle Island indigenous people said you're from somewhere else. We're not telling you you're from Africa. If you're not from Africa, you're not from Africa. You're just not from here. We're not telling you you're from Africa. We're just telling you you're not from here. You don't look like this. And you don't have history here. And your grandmothers can't tell you the stories of the history here. And ours can. Erasing our history is not okay. That's Columbus's words. Do you see that? They are not black as in Guinea, though their hair is straight and coarse. Well, I have African DNA in me, so you put me next to him. I mean, you know. It's not about fighting the white man, as I've explained. White is not your cultural heritage. It is the privilege that you're identifying with. It is about changing the colonial construct and not allowing somebody else to exploit you and use othering to do so. Unless you're saying I'm othering the 1%, in which case I am absolutely othering the 1% to eat the rich every day. And it's not because of who they are as a people, because they're pretty diverse. It is because of their ethics. Thank you, Melissa. So it's not othering if I'm telling you to eat the rich, because they're not a culture. They are, in fact, really unethical and are trying to kill you and are trying to get you to kill anybody but them. Again, I'm going to take off. As I leave, I will remind you all that currently we are involved in a system that just beat a young man to death. And I am so glad that we are finally arresting police officers who do this, as well as so frustrated that it took it being Black officers to arrest. And they didn't arrest the white officers or EMTs involved. As we are spending this time arguing about whether or not it's okay for certain groups to erase other groups of people, I would like to remind you that the true enemy is the system. And that unfortunately we've added another name to the list. And that you should care way more about Tyree Nichols and what happened to him than about erasing somebody else. You should be actively working to overthrow a system that can beat a young man to death and only arrest because it's Black officers. Not supporting their cause or their words. So tonight, the final words that I want you to hear from me, and the words that I want you to hold in your heart, is that yet another death has happened at the hands of a brutal racist system. And that the latest name that we add to the list to be remembered, shouted, and screamed is Tyree Nichols.
I want to show y'all something, and you need to know in advance that if you are triggered by police brutality, you should not watch and you shouldn't listen. This is how the cops treat the indigenous people where I'm from. Native American, if your skin does not look like my skin. Yesterday, a child went out to wander. Yesterday. This street sign that keeps getting vandalized, it's making a lot of people. Hey, everybody, my body is not. Live access is suspended on TikTok because we were talking about why race theory was debunked. And